If you'd open your Bibles to Revelation chapter 18 and verse 24. Revelation chapter 18, verse 24. Thanks, Paul. That feels good. The last two behind the doors, we looked in Revelation 17 and 18. We noticed that the key player in Revelation 17 and 18 is Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. We noticed that Babylon the Great can be none other than the system of Roman Catholicism. We noticed that Babylon the Great from Revelation 17:2 and Revelation 18:3 controls the kings of the earth. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with Rome. We notice that the papacy also controls the merchants of the earth, Revelation 18:3 and Revelation 18:15. In fact, Revelation 18:15 said, "The merchants of these things which were made rich by her." So, not only does the papacy control the great wealthy people of our world, but the wealthy people of our world maintain and gain their wealth from their connection to the Vatican or to the Roman Church system. That's what Revelation 18:15 says. Once again, the merchants of these things which were made rich by her. We also notice that the churches of our world today, excluding none, are under Rome's control. Revelation 17:5 said, "Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth." The harlots represent those churches that have followed in the footsteps of the Roman Catholic Church system. This afternoon, I'd like to take a look. The title of this Behind the Door, Part 34, is called Three Presidents, Three Wars, Three Terrorist Attacks, Three Lies, and when you add those all up, they all equal Sunday. Revelation 18 and verse 24, it says, talking again about Babylon the Great, it says, "And in her, in Babylon the Great, was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth." Now, a principle I believe we can glean from Revelation 18:24 is that the Roman system, if we were just to take the 20th and 21st century, all those who died in the terrors of communism in Russia, all those who died in the wars of World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the war in the Gulf War in the early 1990s, according to the principle of Revelation 18:24, it says that the blood of those who were slain upon the earth is found in one system. That's what the Bible says. And so this one system here in Revelation 18:24 is responsible for all of the blood that has been shed. Now, I want to read a statement to you. It's from a book called Descent into Slavery by Des Griffin. As I've shared with some of you, this individual right here, if you were to sit down with Des Griffin and say, "Des, who is behind all the things going on in our world?" he'd say it's the international bankers. Okay? That's what he'd say. And the other book I'm going to be quoting from today is by G. Edward Griffin. If you asked him, he'd say the same thing. What they don't understand is what Revelation 18 verse 15 says, that the international bankers are under the control of the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. But Des Griffin, in this book on pages 38 and 39, he quotes a man by the name of Albert Pike. This is what Albert Pike stated in a letter to Giuseppe Mazzini, which Pike wrote August 15, 1871. Before I tell you what he said, I want you to understand who Albert Pike was. Albert Pike was the commander of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. He was the top Illuminist in America. Based on the fact that he was the top Illuminist in America, that indicates, because the Illuminati was created by the Jesuit order in 1776, Albert Pike was a Jesuit. Albert Pike worked for the Jesuits' drive to take over the world. Albert Pike was also a leader. I don't remember if he was a general. I believe he was a general for the Confederate Army during the Civil War. And if you go to Washington, D.C. today, there is a very good-sized statue of Albert Pike, paid for by our tax dollars. Albert Pike was a part of the Jesuit drive to reestablish the Pope as the ruler of our world and to bring us back to another dark age. This is what Albert Pike stated in his letter to Giuseppe Mazzini, dated August 15, 1871. Listen carefully. Pike stated that there would be 3 world wars. The First World War was to be fomented in order to destroy Tsarist Russia and to place that vast land under the direct control of Illuminati agents, Jesuit agents. Russia was then to be used as a boogeyman to further the aims of the Illuminati Jesuits worldwide. World War II was to be fomented through manipulation of the differences that existed between German nationalists and political Zionists. This was to result in an expansion of Russian influence and the establishment of a state of Israel in Palestine. What happened after World War II? Does anybody know?
1947.
1947, what happened?
The State of Israel was established.
The State of Israel was established. And Albert Pike said that was going to happen 76 years before it happened.
Remarkable gifts, isn't it? Remarkable.
You know, I'm glad that you made that comment, David, because it's one of 3 things. It's one of 3 things. Either Albert Pike was a prophet. Okay? Yeah, that's wrong. He wasn't a prophet. Or Albert Pike was a part of a group that was planning and plotting the destruction of the world and the reestablishment of the Pope. Okay? Or the guy is an idiot and he just happened to make a guess and came out right. Okay? Now the first and third don't hold any water at all. But the second one, he was a part of the Jesuits, and they were planning these wars to take over the world. We're going to look at them in a little bit more detail here shortly. The Third World War, listen carefully to this. The Third World War was planned to result from the differences stirred up by Illuminati agents, Jesuit agents, between the Zionists and the Arabs. Now, what's a Zionist? A Jew. Or somebody who is pro-Jew. Okay? Now, according to Albert Pike, there would be a Third World War, and it would be between Zionists and the Arabs. Now, let me ask you something. What nationality is Saddam Hussein? He's an Arab. How about the people of Afghanistan? What were they? The Taliban. Arabs. Now, can you tell me the two world powers in our world today that are the most pro-Israel or pro-Zion? The United States and what else? England. That's right. So Albert Pike in 1871 said there would be a third world war, and it would be between Zionist forces and the Arabs. You know what? Albert Pike was talking about 2000, 2001, wasn't he? That's what he was talking about. 129 years before the event. What's that? Zionists or Jews or any group that is pro-Israel. Those are Zionists. Listen to what Albert Pike said about this third war that the Jesuit order had planned all the way back in the 1800s. This third war was planned to spread worldwide. The Illuminati, i.e. the Jesuits, planned to unleash the nihilists and atheists and provoke a social cataclysm. And what would be the result of this third war? Listen to Pike. This is how he says it. He said, "The world then, disillusioned with Christianity, anxious for an ideal but not knowing where to render its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out in the public view, a manifestation which will result from the general reactionary movement which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism." So what did Albert Pike say? This Jesuit, what did he say would come on the heels of this third world war between the Arabs and the pro-Zionists? He said that out in full view would come he calls it the pure doctrine of Lucifer. Now I want you to think, and we'll look at it a little bit later, what is the doctrine of Lucifer? What's the ultimate thing that he is trying to bring the world? What's he been trying to make the world worship for 6,000 years? Think about that. And I'll give you a couple of clues. Stonehenge, the Parthenon, St. Peter's Square in Rome would all be things that have been established in order to bring forth the true doctrine of Lucifer. Now, I want you to go back. Let's look at these three. The first one, Pike said, the First World War was to be fomented to destroy Tsarist Russia. That one we call World War I. Now, was Tsarist Russia destroyed during World War I? Absolutely. Nicholas was the last Tsar of Russia. His wife, Alexandra, and all their children were killed. And that was the last Tsar that ever reigned in Russia. So Albert Pike, 46 years before the event, he stated, Tsarist Russia will be destroyed during the First World War. And it was destroyed. And then that vast land would be put under the direct control of Illuminati, or, my words, Jesuit agents. Do you know who Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, do you know who they worked for? They worked for Rome. They set up communism. They set up the ideals of Karl Marx. The ideals of Karl Marx originated in the writings of Adam Weishaupt. And Adam Weishaupt was a foot soldier of the Jesuit order. So Lenin, Stalin, all those leaders of Russia, they did the bidding of the Jesuit order. Now you say, but wait a minute. All during my lifetime, there was a Cold War up until the late 1980s between communism and capitalism against the communist East and the democratic West. We've heard that, haven't we? And folk, all that was a gigantic smokescreen. Because the East was under the control of the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church, and so has been the West. They have been used to play off the world in order to bring the Pope to the pinnacle of power in this world. Now, Pike stated that's what happened in World War I. Tsarist Russia would be destroyed. Let me ask a question. Who was the president of the United States when World War I was fought? What was his name? Woodrow Wilson. Okay? Woodrow Wilson. Up until World War I, had America ever fought in a foreign war across the Atlantic Ocean? We never had we? Do you know why we had never fought in a foreign war before World War I? The Monroe Doctrine. You remember back in around 1823, the president at that time was James Monroe, and James Monroe realized that the leaders of Europe, the Pope, and the Jesuit order, they were planning on destroying America and all popular governments. So James Monroe, with the influence and encouragement of Thomas Jefferson, he gave his famous speech in Congress, and it became known as the Monroe Doctrine. And in that speech, James Monroe told the emperors of Europe, he said, look it, if you ever come across the Atlantic and colonize in the Western Hemisphere, or you ever make inroads in this hemisphere, America will consider it an act of war. And Monroe said, you stay on that side of the Atlantic, and we'll stay on our side. So up until World War I, America never engaged in a foreign war across the Atlantic. What was it that brought America into World War I? The sinking of the Lusitania. It was a terrorist attack. Sinking of Lusitania. What happened? I'll read it to you. A little bit of history, but I think it's very instructive for us today. This was the way that America was to be brought into the war. It was through a terrorist attack, the sinking of the Lusitania. This is taken from the book Creature from Jekyll Island, page 260, 261. It says neutral nations, okay, let's see. Since neutral nations were prohibited from doing that by treaty, that was helping other governments who were in the war, America would have to be brought into the war. A secret agreement was made between British officials and Colonel Edward Mandell House. He was basically, as Woodrow Wilson said, Edward Mandell House was my other self. Edward Mandell House basically ran Woodrow Wilson. Okay, it says from that point on, a secret agreement was made between the British and House with the concurrence of Woodrow Wilson. From that point on, Woodrow Wilson began to pressure Congress to declare war. This was done at the very time Woodrow Wilson was campaigning for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." So what is Griffin saying? Behind the scenes, Woodrow Wilson was planning with Edward Mandell House to bring America into World War I. While he was planning that behind the scenes, he was trying to be reelected to the presidency. And you know how he was trying to get reelected? He was telling the American people, "I've kept your boys out of this war, therefore vote for me." Now that's a lie, isn't it? The President of the United States was lying to the American people, planning to bring us into the war, and running on a ticket that said, "I've kept you out of the war, now vote for me." Well, what was the Lusitania? The Lusitania was a large ship. It was owned by the British Cunard Lines, which was a fleet of ships. The Lusitania was built to military specifications and was registered with the British Admiralty as an armed auxiliary cruiser. The Lusitania carried passengers as a cover to conceal her real mission, which was to bring contraband war materials from the United States. This fact was known to Woodrow Wilson and others in his administration, but they didn't do anything to stop it. When the German embassy tried to publish a warning to American passengers, the State Department intervened and prevented newspapers from printing it. When the Lusitania left New York Harbor on her final voyage, she was virtually a floating ammunition depot. Now, what is G. Edward Griffin saying? He's simply saying this. The Lusitania was carrying a lot of civilians across the Atlantic Ocean. But the Lusitania was such a large ship, it wasn't just carrying passengers, it was also carrying war materials that the Americans were sending over to the British. So if the Lusitania was ever attacked, because it had so many war materials on board, it was like a walking powder keg. It would blow to smithereens. G. Edward Griffin also said there that the German embassy in America warned and said, "Don't any Americans get on board the Lusitania. If you do, you're putting your life into danger." But G. Edward Griffin also brings out that the Germans' warning to the American people was never allowed in the newspapers. There's only one newspaper. That was in the Des Moines Register. That was the only newspaper that was allowed to run the ad put in there by the German embassy to warn the Americans not to go on the Lusitania. So what happens? The British knew that to draw the United States into the war would mean the difference between defeat and victory. And anything that could accomplish that was proper. Did you notice that? Anything you can kill, you can maim, you can destroy you can destroy however many millions of people you need to, as long as you get what you want. The end justifies the means. Now, obviously, there weren't millions of people on the Lusitania, but the point was, they would sacrifice innocent people to get what they wanted. And that was, they wanted America in the war. Now, does that make you think about anything? Were there innocent people in the 21st century who were innocent pawns in the great big game of the Jesuit order, and they were sacrificed on a date called September 11th, 2001, in order to bring America into the Third War? The trick was to have Americans on board the Lusitania in order to create the proper emotional climate in the United States. As the Lusitania moved into hostile waters, they're heading towards Europe, they're getting closer and closer to shore. There was a German U-boat operating. The First Lord of the British Admiralty, a man by the name of Winston Churchill. You ever heard that guy's name? Oh, blood, sweat, and tears, right? Winston Churchill was a part of this game, folk. He was a player in the Jesuits' plan to take over the world. That's who Winston Churchill really was. Winston Churchill ordered her destroyer protection to abandon her. You see, there was at least one ship that as the Lusitania approached, another ship was to go out and act as a protector to bring the Lusitania safely to harbor. But Winston Churchill told the ship to abandon its purpose. It was to withdraw and not get anywhere near the Lusitania. Why? Because the Lusitania was to be destroyed. Not only did he do that, the Lusitania had been ordered to travel at reduced speed, which made her an easy target. After the German U-boat hit the Lusitania with one well-placed torpedo, a mighty second explosion from within the Lusitania ripped her apart. And the ship that many believe could not be sunk gurgled to the bottom in less than 18 minutes. And the day it happened, Woodrow Wilson went to the Rose Garden there at the White House, and he said, I knew the Lusitania was going to be bombed. I knew that Churchill was a bad guy. We've got to get those guys for destroyed, didn't he? No, he didn't. You know what Woodrow Wilson said? He said, America, do you want to see your freedom sacrificed at the hands of these German people who are trying to destroy democracy? Do you want to see that? And what is any American going to say? Any American's going to say, we're going to go fight them, let's go! And so America went to war built on the lie that we were going to keep the world safe and America's freedoms would be left intact. So we would fight for freedom and democracy. Save freedom and democracy, Woodrow Wilson told the American people. And it took the American people all of about a day or two to be ready for war. All built on the lie that this war would save America's freedom. There was a second war. According to Albert Pike and Des Griffin's book, what was the purpose of the Second War? It was to result in an expansion of Russian influence and the establishment of a state of Israel in Palestine. Did those things happen? after World War II? Was Russia's influence, did it expand around the world? Of course it did. Of course it did. Not only did Russia's influence expand, but also the establishment of a state of Israel in Palestine. So we have World War II. And who was the president? Who was the president? Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt. World War II. But there wouldn't, I mean, you know, there wouldn't be another terrorist attack to bring America into that war, would there? That's exactly right. The Second World War started in 1939, but America didn't join in 1939 because the records show that prior to America coming into this war, World War I, 85% of the American people didn't want to go to war. And so America stayed out of World War I for the first 2 years. The World War II was virtually the same thing. It started in 1939. America did not want to engage in the Second World War. And so how would America be brought into the Second World War? Another terrorist attack. And this terrorist attack we call Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor. And you say, well, those Japanese people, they deserve to be relocated. The Japanese people on the West Coast, they were relocated and put into concentration camps in the Midwest of our country. And they deserved it because they were threats to American freedom. Well, that's what we were told. But in actuality, and I'll read it to you, the Japanese were goaded by this man to attack Pearl Harbor. They were pushed by Roosevelt and his people in order for the Japanese to attack. Folk, you think about it for just a minute. What person in their right mind, what little island nation in their right mind would attack the most powerful nation on the face of the earth? What nation in their right mind would do such a thing? Were the Japanese that foolish to think that they could attack the United States and somehow defeat America? Let's see here. This is taken from Des Griffin's book, page 195 and 196. It says this: starting with the outbreak of war in Europe in 1939, the Roosevelt administration was determined to get the United States involved. Contrary to the Monroe Doctrine and the wishes of 85% of the American people, Roosevelt and Congress virtually declared war on Germany and her allies March 14, 1941, with the adoption of the Lend-Lease Bill, under which the United States guaranteed to supply the Crown, i.e. the Jesuits, with all the war material they needed. A few months earlier, in his campaign for re-election, FDR vowed that our boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. All the while, Roosevelt and his secret mentors were scheming to bring the heavy-duty American war equipment into the conflict. In deliberate efforts to goad the Japanese into an imprudent move, Roosevelt cut off supplies of aviation fuel and steel to Japan and froze Japanese assets in the United States. In a book called The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, page 5, it says this: Rear Admiral Theobald tells us in his book The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, diplomatically, President Roosevelt's strategy of forcing Japan to war by unremitting and ever-increasing diplomatic and economic pressure, and by simultaneously holding our fleet in Hawaii as an invitation to a surprise attack, was a complete success. One is forced to conclude that the anxiety to have Japan commit the first act of war caused the President and his civilian advisors to disregard the military advice to move the fleet, which would have somewhat cushioned the blow. During 1940 and 1941, American intelligence broke both the Japanese diplomatic and military codes. Roosevelt and his advisors knew in advance the exact date and time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Updated decoding machines were supplied to strategic American outposts around the world, but were denied to the military at Pearl Harbor. So Franklin Roosevelt used economic sanctions to goad the Japanese into the Second World War. In a book written by Hamilton Fish called FDR, The Other Side of the Coin, Hamilton Fish was a congressman, pages 132 and 134. He says this: President Roosevelt's responsibility for goading the Japanese into war by sending a war ultimatum on November 26, 1941, demanding that the Japanese withdraw all troops from Indochina, is a historic fact, although a closely guarded secret. FDR's war ultimatum was deliberately withheld from Congress until after Pearl Harbor. All agreed that the ultimatum left Japan no alternative but war. The Japanese would have done almost anything to avoid war with America. Prince Kanoe, the Prime Minister, who was very peacefully inclined, repeatedly requested to come to Washington or Honolulu to meet with President Roosevelt. He was willing to agree to our terms to keep out of war on a modus vivendi, but FDR refused to talk with the Japanese Prime Minister simply because he was determined to get into war with Japan, and through that with Germany. The American ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph Grew, knew how much the Japanese wanted to maintain peaceful relations and urged such a conference. But FDR and his fellow ardent interventionists used dodges and tricks to involve us in a totally unnecessary war. And what did FDR tell the American people while that was going on? While I'm talking to you mothers and fathers, he said, I give you one more assurance. I've said this before and I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. Roosevelt is preparing the Japanese to attack at Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. And while he is preparing that, he is telling the American people, your boys will never fight in a foreign war. You know what that's called? That's a lie. Franklin Roosevelt was lying through the skin of his teeth because his Jesuit masters told him to lie to the American people to bring us into World War II. And the mechanism that was used to bring America into this war was a terrorist attack at Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. And the next day, or even maybe it was that day, but Franklin Roosevelt went to Congress, and before Congress and all the American people, he said, "This is a day that will live in infamy." You remember that speech? You've heard that. I used to send chills down my spine because I'm thinking, oh, to save the world for freedom. And all that time, Franklin Roosevelt was planning. He was planning that. And what did he tell America for why they had to go to war to fight those Axis powers of Japan and Germany and Italy? Why? To make the world safe for democracy, for freedom. Same lie of Woodrow Wilson. Save freedom and democracy. This same man who was giving this line to the American people, 3 years later went to a place called Yalta and agreed with Winnie Churchill and Joseph Stalin of Russia on how the world was to be divided up after World War II. So Franklin Roosevelt saving the world for freedom? He was lying by the skin of his teeth. And so there's two wars outlined by Jesuit Albert Pike. Two presidents, two wars, two terrorist attacks, and two lies. And Albert Pike said there'd be one more. He said there'd be a third world war. He said it was planned to spread worldwide, which would give the indication that it would not start off in the beginning as a world war. It would start off as a local conflict, maybe in one particular area, but it would then spread. World War III, between the Zionists and the Arabs. Who do you think this third president is right here? His name is George Bush. World War III. And what would be the terrorist attack that would make Americans think they would have to go to far-off places like Afghanistan and Iraq in order? What terrorist attack would it be? It was called September 11th, 2001. And do you remember what George Bush said for why America had to respond to this terrorist attack? What was under threat, according to the President of the United States? That was another one, Jim, that's right. George Bush said that freedom is under attack. And George Bush said freedom would be defended. You remember that? The Taliban, Saddam Hussein, they have attacked freedom. And George Bush declared to America and the world that freedom would be defended. Three presidents, 3 wars, 3 terrorist attacks, 3 lies. Now we were told, and I want to pick up on that one. How much time? Okay, good. We were told that the reason we were going to war was, number one, to punish those who attacked America. Now that's what we were told. And then, of course, we were told we were going to have to save freedom. We've also been told that the reason why we're having to go to war in Iraq is because there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That's not true, according to Albert Pike. Albert Pike he wasn't trying to hide anything, because he was writing to one of his associates. Giuseppe Mazzini was an associate Jesuit of Albert Pike's. It said here, the Third World War was planned to result from the differences stirred up by Illuminati Jesuit agents. So who started this last war? Was it because of weapons of mass destruction? No. This third war, folk, was created. George Bush as president, Jesuit agents, or just plain Jesuits. Illuminati agents, Jesuit agents, influencing George Bush in the West, the Taliban and Saddam Hussein in the Middle East. They're the ones that have stirred up this conflict of World War III. The conflict was planned to spread worldwide between Zionists and the Arabs. It says, the citizens, disillusioned with Christianity, will from that moment be without compass, anxious for an ideal, but not knowing where to render its adoration. And they will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out in the public view. The doctrine of Lucifer. On the heels of this conflict, the doctrine of Lucifer is going to come out in full view. According to Albert Pike. Now I ask you, what is the doctrine of Lucifer? What is it that he has wanted and sought for the people to worship for 6,000 years in complete rejection of the Creator? What is it that he tries to make people to worship? What is it? It's the sun. The most powerful entity in our world is the sun. In our physical world, it's the most powerful element. And the doctrine of Lucifer is wrapped up in sun worship. From the days of Nimrod, a great-grandson of Noah, when they left the mountains of Ararat in eastern Turkey, they made their way down near the plains of Shinar in what we know of today as Babylon or Iraq. Nimrod instituted sun worship there, and throughout the world we see monuments of sun worship. We see Stonehenge in England. We see the Parthenon. We see St. Peter's. In Rome. All monuments exalting the sun as the object of man's worship. And folk, the ultimate manifestation of sun worship that will come on the heels of when this war comes to an end, the ultimate manifestation of the true doctrine of Lucifer is called Sunday, or the worship of the sun. And according to Albert Pike, who's been right far too many times, Sunday worship will come on the heels of World War III. So folk, while we can look in history, as I've heard many people tell me, they say, man, I can't stand history, it's so dry. Well, folk, the last 100 years and the wars that have been fought, they have all been pointing down towards the doctrine of Lucifer, which is Sunday worship. World War I was part of the Jesuit scheme. World War II was part of the Jesuit scheme. And World War III is also part of that scheme, leading the world